Thank you for joining us for this program, Evolution Impossible, The Evidence. I'm Dr. John Ashton. The theory of evolution is taught as a mechanical explanation for our existence. It was written up in Darwin's book on the origin of species in 1859 as the processes by which organisms change over time as a result of changes in heritable, physical or behavioural traits. The changes as a result of mutations that allow an organism to better adapt to its environment will help it survive and have more offspring. So that was the basic idea. Many textbooks and biology professors now claim something along the lines that evolution by natural selection is one of the best substantiated theories in the history of science, supported by evidence from a wide variety of scientific disciplines, including paleontology, geology, genetics, and developmental biology. Now, I personally would seriously challenge that statement that it's one of the best substantiated theories, because from my perspective, the evidence now points that that is absolutely impossible. Also, we have powerful evidence, we know from a Christian worldview, that God created the heavens and the earth, that there is a supernatural existence that pre-existed this physical universe, and that supernatural creator, God, must be responsible for all the different forms of life. And the scientific evidence now is confirming that. And yet these statements still persist. Let me explain why I've made those assertions. The problem is that these statements are misleading. The mechanisms described can cause changes in size, colour, fur, length, etc. But they cannot produce a new functioning body part or a different kind of plant and animal. So I'll just repeat that again. The mechanisms described in the preceding sort of statements can cause changes in size, colour, fur, length, and etc. But they cannot produce a new type of functioning body part or a different kind of plant or animal. Now, fortunately now, as a result of the growing awareness in this area, over 1,000 scientists have now signed the following dissension from Darwinism statement. So let's have a look at this. And this can be found if you Google dissentfromdarwin.org, and you can find the list of scientists there. But this is what they've asserted now. We are sceptical of the claims for the ability of random mutations and natural selection to account for the complexity of life. Careful examination of the evidence for Darwinian theory should be encouraged. And of course, James M. Tour is one of the people, as I mentioned in an earlier talk, who have signed this. So why is this now growing dissent from the theory of evolution? Well, every living organism on Earth is constructed by molecular machinery, which can read an instruction manual written in a special language. And this language consists of 4 specific tiny molecular structures which are the letters of the language. Now, every different living organism has a different instruction manual, which we call DNA. Now, if I put these words up on the board there, most of us cannot read this language. It's a code. But my best friend in primary school could read it because it's Latvian. And the words are fish, amphibian, and reptile. But unless we have the right language translated, we can't translate. Unless we have the right code reader, unless we are correctly programmed to understand and read that particular language, it doesn't mean anything to us. We have to have the right language reader. And so for the DNA code, the same problem exists. Now if we look, Zivis is code for fish in Latvian, Pomme is code for apple in French. But neither zivus or fish look like a fish. And pomme or apple, they don't look like an apple. So there's no sort of obvious direct association physically between the object and the code. The code is something that is synthetically constructed by an intelligence. We're an intelligence. We have constructed that code. And they're codes, and they need a code reader, which is, in our case, our mind. And so in my view, the way I look at it is the fact that the DNA there is a code, it's a language, strongly points to the existence of a supernatural mind that created that language. Because again, the DNA code doesn't look anything like what it encodes for. The molecular structures within the DNA code don't look anything like, a liver cell or a brain cell or a reproductive cell or a bone or a skin cell or anything like that. They're code, they're a language. And again, we know languages come from a mind that creates a code, and the mind is the translator. And unless you have the right mind, you can't read, or your mind is programmed correctly, you can't read the code. So zivus is code for fish in Latvian. It has 5 letters. The code in English has 4 letters. But the DNA code to make a fish has 1.5 billion letters called base pairs. So again, this shows the amazing complexity of this code. We can say the word fish and we can imagine a fish in our mind, but we can't make a fish. But a little fish cell can grow into a fish, a little fish gamete cell, and that little code, that tiny little cell, contains a code with 1.5 billion code pieces in it that encode for the fish. And similarly, pomme, the code for apple in French and in English, has 5 letters. But the DNA code to make an apple has 750 million letters in it. And so I think, to me, again, this is powerful evidence for a creator, for a supernatural creator. Professor John Lennox, who's Professor of Mathematics at the University of Oxford, he points out, or maybe he quotes someone else who points it out, but we have this search in outer space for extraterrestrial life. And what we're looking for is some sort of little code in some sort of radio signal, microwave signal that we get that represents some sort of intelligence. And there's some sort of systematic pattern to it that we could recognise as a language. And here we have a language occurring in the DNA code of life, but we're not saying that's responsible for some super intelligence. We're not saying that this is powerful evidence for God. Whereas I think, wow, we have powerful evidence for God in the DNA code. The scientists that ignore this evidence, in my view, are ignoring something that is very, very obvious, that can only be accounted for the existence of a supernatural creator. Now, all living things have their own DNA code. Each flower has a different code, each insect has a different code, each bird has a different code, all the different parts of a plant require a different code, and these codes are very large and complex, as we've just illustrated. Now, the DNA molecules contain the blueprints for how a human being, a plant, or a bacterium looks and functions. But the DNA molecule is passive. It's just a code. It's just like if you have a textbook or an instruction manual, maybe it would be a better thing. If we have, well, let's say a recipe book. The recipe book sits there, it can't make the recipes. The only way the recipes can be made is if a mind comes along that can control a machine, us, a body, can read the instructions in the recipe book and then go ahead and make the cake or whatever the food is. But you have to have something that can read the code and then translate that code into something physical. And so it's the same with DNA. The DNA is just like a recipe book. A recipe book isn't going to make a cake. A recipe book just has the codes to make a cake and the instructions to make a cake. And so it's the same. If there was just the DNA code form, there would still be no life. The DNA needs a ribosome to translate the DNA code and convert the information in the DNA blueprint into the components of the living organism. So we need this ribosome. So this ribosome is an amazing machine, and based upon the information in the DNA, ribosomes make proteins, such as oxygen transporting hemoglobin, antibodies of the immune system, hormones such as insulin, the collagen of the skin, or the enzymes that break down sugar. There are tens of thousands of proteins in the body, and they all have different forms and functions. They build and construct life at the chemical level, at the molecular chemical level. And so this is what the ribosome does. It reads the code, and it's a little molecular factory that can read the code and make these particular proteins. Now, it wasn't until 2009, well, scientists were awarded then, the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for working out the molecular structure of the ribosome, which is made up of hundreds of thousands of atoms. So in order for the DNA code to work, we have to have this little molecular machine that is constructed of hundreds of thousands of atoms. Now, people who believe in evolution and don't believe in a supernatural God creating this system have to believe that this particular ribosome molecular factory arose by chance. They have to believe that a fully functioning molecular factory composed of hundreds of thousands of atoms that can specifically translate the DNA code into all these amazing compounds required for life arose by chance mutations, chance chemical reactions from a non-living entity. So we see that there, just in this is powerful evidence for the existence of a supernatural God. And it took a team of scientists from top universities in the world to work out just its structure. They still haven't worked out exactly how it all works, but just to work out its structure. And that's a diagram of the structure of a ribosome. So without a ribosome, the DNA blueprint is useless. Evolutionists have to believe that this complex molecular machine, which is perfectly matched to translate the DNA code, arose by blind chance mutations at the same time as the DNA codes. And this is chemically impossible in a non-living system. The DNA language system and the ribosome translation machine are clear evidence of supernatural intelligent design, God. And this is so important. So we have this overwhelming evidence for the existence of a supernatural God. There's a multitude of molecular machines in living organisms, so not just ribosomes, which cannot be adequately explained by evolutionary mechanisms. These machines clearly point to intelligent design and supernatural creation, as it is impossible for these complex machines to form by chance. So a lot of information about these on the internet. For example, now here's a quote from Objective Proficiency Students Book Pack by the authors are down there. That's the quote down there. This one here, from Physics Today in May 2006, pages 38 to 43, which was discussing the molecular machinery in living cells, and the scientists authors write, "It is surely one of the triumphs of evolution that nature discovered how to make highly molecular machines in such a noisy environment." How can nature discover something? You know, nature just is, according to them, just random chemical reactions. But again, this points to intelligent design. These highly accurate machines represent intelligent design, not random processes. And then, of course, you know, many of the secular scientists forget that where did the laws of physics and chemistry come from? How did atoms evolve, the structure of the particles in atoms and force fields? All these things point to a supernatural creator. And in a 2013 Cambridge University textbook, and that's the reference down there, the authors write, somehow nature discovered how to build the intricate machines we call the living cell, using the raw materials at hand and all jumbled up. And so it's saying that somehow all these jumbled up raw materials formed these machines. And of course, James M. Tour, Dr. James M. Tour, one of the most highly cited synthetic chemists in the world, points out, hang on, you can't synthesize these machines by basic chemical reactions. They're too complex. You can't make them. Another one, 2015, Princeton University text on neurobiology. The author writes about the sensory fibres of the cranial nerves, and this is what he says. It's simply not apparent how these two sources of small diameter sensory fibres were combined during evolution. Nature learned how to combine these types to generate the homeostatic sensory inputs, and we need to figure out how. So again, they're looking at nature and saying, wow, how did these amazing systems form, these amazing networks form by random chance? No, all these things are powerful evidence of an intelligent designer, a supernatural intelligent designer. Another one, the author of a June 2016 paper published in Science Advances describing the light scattering properties of butterfly wings and the so-called defects in the tiny photonic crystals that enhance the insect's brightness and beauty. And this is what he wrote. He did his PhD at University of California, San Diego in this area. He wrote, in the evolution of the butterfly wings, see, they've got to go there. It appears that nature learned how to engineer these defects on purpose. So again, these scientists, but they can't say it points to creation. They've got to say somehow nature learned, somehow blind evolutionary forces formed these amazing systems. Well, we know they can't. It doesn't work. The chemistry doesn't work that way. It can't construct these things blindly. And the probability is just absolutely impossible for these things to occur by chance. And I think there's a big gap between what the biologists and the chemists understand in terms of probability and mathematics of these reactions. Another one, 2015, McGill University text on evolution. Nature is described as the ultimate builder of tools. And so we can see the evidence pointing to a creator is overwhelming. But there's so much more evidence for design in nature. For example, did you know that plants have a mini chemical reactor called photosystem 2 that uses sunlight to split water into oxygen and hydrogen ions? And using this complex biochemical chemistry, plants combine this hydrogen with carbon dioxide to make carbohydrates, which then become the foods. And this is an amazing complex system. They've only just recently worked out structure, and they're still actually not sure, I think, how the water molecules are actually bound. But this is a machine that combines two water molecules and then zaps them with sunlight, well, from the energy from sunlight picked up by chlorophyll. It's an extremely complex machine. Now I was reading a report just recently from the University of Sydney where they've come up with a new catalyst to split water into hydrogen and oxygen. And this is teams of scientists working for years. And here we say, well, hang on, just random process produce this amazing molecular machine in plants? You know, the evidence is overwhelming that this world, this universe is the product of a super intelligent, supernatural creator. It's revealing that God created the atmosphere with carbon dioxide on day 2, plants on day 3, sunlight for the plants on day 4, and the plants provided the food for all for life created on days 5 and 6. I think, people say, oh, this creation story is just a made-up thing. Sure, it's not detailed science, but the facts are right, and the facts are confirmed all the time by our evidence. Many science textbooks assert that all the different forms of life came about as a result of mutations in the DNA, causing changes in the organism, with certain changes surviving better in nature, and this is the theory of evolution. But in reality, mutations don't produce new viable DNA codes. They can damage the code and they produce disease or minor changes. They can't produce a new type of organism. The codes required to change a body part into a different body part are enormous. Few mutations aren't going to cause that to happen, or replications. The mutations do not produce the huge new DNA codes. Tens of thousands of new letters, all in the correct sequence, are necessary to produce a new type of body part. Mutations involve changes to the molecular structure of DNA. These changes are random. They do not encode new information or new design. The new information in a code to produce new design requires an intelligent programmer. So we've talked about how if you've got a probability less than 1 in 10 with 150 zeros afterwards, regarded as impossible. So the probability of one small gene forming by chance, I've explained in previous talk, is less than 1 in 10 with 190 zeros afterwards. So it's impossible for a gene to form by chance. And again, there's a reference to the calculations underpinning that. Many students think that scientists know how life on Earth evolved, but in reality, science do not know. The University of California Museum of Paleontology at Berkeley, in their Evolution 101 website states, biologists are trying to figure out how evolution happens, and that's not an easy job. And you can see Evolution Berkeley, EDU, down there. They go on to say one of the questions that evolutionary biologists are trying to answer is, how does evolution produce new and complex features? And of course, University of California, Berkeley is one of the top secular universities in the US. And here, for example, Dr. James M. Tour is one of the most highly cited chemists in the world. He creates new molecules. That's his job, to build new molecules that might have applications in defence, medicine, and so forth. He has challenged for someone to explain to him how evolution can occur. No one has. He talks about how, rather in private, leading scientists admit to him that they do not know. And you can see that's his personal website there, James M. Tour, and you can read about that in that link there on his website. The formation of substantial amounts of new DNA code to produce the new and complex features is fundamental for evolution to occur. And without it, evolution is without foundation. But to date, no experiments have demonstrated a possible mechanism. So again, the evidence isn't there as well. Now, there was a Dr. Richard Lenski at Michigan State University, and he bred E. coli through 32,000 generations, and they were still E. coli. No significant new genetic code was observed to form. Instead, some of the bacteria were able to duplicate a citric acid transfer gene next to a promoter, which controls another gene, but now switched on the citrate transporter gene, which enabled the bacteria to use citrate as a food. But again, that was just the duplication of existing code. It wasn't the production of new code. And Dr. Lenski and his team continued to breed. In 2020, after 73,500 generations, the E. coli was still E. coli. They had not even evolved into a different species of bacteria, let alone a more complex organism. However, and this is an important point, half of the populations have evolved defects in their DNA repair mechanisms. So what we can see is the result. Now this is experiment. This is real life evolutionary experiment to demonstrate, can evolution work? They're bred through 73,500 generations, no new species formed. What's happened? Half the bacteria involved have developed defects in their actual DNA repair mechanism. And that's likely to, if it was in, say, something like us humans and this sort of thing, that's likely to lead to things like cancer and all sorts of diseases. So the amount of genetic information in code all living things in our planet is astronomically huge. It's hard for our mind to get around how much information is encoded in life. We look at plants, animals, different birds. Somebody was talking to me the other day that just in our local areas he's seen something like 160 different types of birds flying around, let alone all the different types of little spiders, beetles, bugs, butterflies, plants, weeds, and all the other animals that are around. And that's just in our little local area. So let's have a look at some of these. In our E. coli that we were just studying, there's about 4.6 million DNA base pairs in the code. If that was to evolve into a brewer's yeast cell, it has 12.1 million base pairs. So the evolution from bacterium to a yeast requires 7.5 million new pieces of code. And according to evolutionists, all this code has to arise by random chance, and we're still up to single-cell organisms. And so it's statistically and scientifically impossible, and these are just single-cell organisms. A yeast is still a single-cell organism. But this is a huge amount of increase in code just in the complexity of a yeast with a different reproductive system and so forth. Our brewer's yeast has around 6,000 genes. If we go to a little roundworm, a little nematode, they're about 5 millimetres long. They're often studied in the laboratory. It has about 97 million base pairs spread over 19,000 genes. So for a yeast to evolve in something like a little roundworm that has a mouth, has a basic digestive system, basic reproductive system, and so forth, very basic. We've got to evolve by chance, requires 85 million base pairs of new genetic code spread over 13,000 extra genes, all to arise by chance that work. Now, of course, evolution says that, hang on, this occurred over, millions of years and slowly one thing changed to another. But the thing is, it's got to work, and we don't see evidence of those changes occurring, even in 73,000 generations. In just a simple bacteria, let alone in something as complex as this. Those bacteria haven't produced new quantities of new genetic code at that time. And so this is a major stumbling block. We have the evidence that demonstrates that evolution doesn't occur, despite all these claims. Evolution requires that all this new code, via mutations, mind you, and we're only up to worms, and we can see that this is impossible. If we look at a mouse, for example, 2.6 million base pairs in its DNA code. And so that's 2.5 billion more pieces of new code compared to a worm. And according to evolution again, all this perfectly functioning code has to arise by chance. But what did we observe, remember, with the bacteria? What happened? Not huge pieces of new code were forming. Instead, her DNA, the repair mechanism to ensure that at least the code was preserved, was failing. And a mouse is just one of 5,500 known mammals, all with complex codes like that, but they're different. And let's have a look at how many different species there are in the earth. Okay, so there's about 5,500 different species of mammals documented, nearly 10,000 species of birds, and you can see the numbers for the different reptiles. There's huge numbers, and all these different species have different codes, and all these different perfectly functioning codes that are extremely complex are supposed to have arisen by chance. And we go down to when we get to the insects and so forth, and then different spiders and ticks and things, and then different types of shells and mollusca and different types of plants, algae and fungi, all of different fungi and bacteria. And so it's just over 1 million as well of other types of organisms, all different types of organisms that aren't described here, but all these different species have all different complex amounts of code and very large DNAs as well. In 2009, there were, as you can see, nearly 2 million different species noted in the scientific literature. Now, scientists believe there's actually a lot more still to be discovered. But this estimate represents only 1 to 2% of the species that have existed in the past, for example, when we look at the fossil record. So we've got about 100 million to 200 million species have been created by God in the past. Evolutionists have to believe that all these different codes arose by chance, that all work. The probability is just enormous, that it's absolutely impossible to have ever occurred. And matter of fact, what we actually observe is the very opposite to evolution. Here we have Professor Wilson at Harvard, one of the world's leading entomologists, points out it's been estimated the Earth is currently losing about 0.25% of its remaining species each year. And the fossil record confirms massive extinctions in the past. We don't see new kinds of life evolving. We see only minor changes in the species of fur colour or something, not new species forming, just changes in species. And yet what we're actually observing is the loss of species, the loss of information. What we observe in our present environment and in the fossil record is the extinction of fully developed species, not evolution. And there's another side to the mutation. The DNA system has built-in mechanisms to preserve the code and repair mutations back to the original. However, what we find is that over successive generations there is more and more damage to the code which has not been repaired. And this results generally in less fitness for survival. So this is, evolution says you've got to produce new code or mutations that equip better survival. But what we actually observe is less fitness for survival. So what we actually observe and measure in the laboratory today is the very opposite for evolution. That's why genetic diseases are increasing and so forth, that we observe in humans. So, scientists observe the steady loss of genetic information all around us. What we actually observe is the very opposite to evolution. We observe plants and animals steadily becoming extinct. We observe the mutation errors in the DNA code steadily increasing. The fossil record is a record of fully formed organisms that lived in the past, not a record of organisms slowly changing. People arrange the tables and have them in slowly changing, and maybe that roughly fits the sedimentary deposition, but we don't know how things were mixed up during the flood and so forth. We know there was a massive flood in the past. The evidence for that is all around. Catastrophic past is not denied by scientists now. The Earth had a catastrophic past. The Earth was covered entirely with water extinction event. And the fossil record, the fossils, the animals and plants stay the same from the time they first appear in the lower strata until the time the last appear in the higher strata. They don't show evolution occurring. Fully formed animals just occur in the fossil record. It's a human construct to arrange them in an order that supposedly supports evolution. The fossils of animals and plants not extinct are also the same as their relatives living today. And they have not changed over the millions of years. So highly complex life forms which require very complex DNA codes like trilobites are found in the oldest and deepest fossil bearing layers. There's no evidence of advanced ancestors in the older layers, no evidence of evolution. And that's a really good book there, Darwin's Doubt by Dr. Stephen Meyer, deals with that in detail. And Dr. Stephen Meyer, as I said in a previous talk, he is a University of Cambridge trained philosopher of science. The bottom line from the biochemistry and the fossil record is evolution's impossible and never happened. Creation by a super intelligent mind is the only possible explanation. This fits the Bible account. It confirms the Bible account that life on earth was created by a loving creator God. But you know, there's more. Evolution cannot explain the origin of the mind, which is a non-material entity. Our mind is essentially who we are. So, for example, you can weigh your brain. If you were dead, your brain could be cut out and weighed or squashed into a measuring cylinder and its volume measured. But you can't measure your thoughts. Your thoughts are non-material. You can't weigh your thoughts. But the thoughts are who you are, and the thoughts are what connect you with God. And evolution attempts to explain molecular changes. They can't explain consciousness. They can't explain your thoughts. Our mind is essentially who we are, and it's through our mind that we have a relationship with Christ and eternal life. It's our non-material mind which connects us with the non-material super creator God. And we know there that Jesus pointed out that God wants us to have eternal life. This is his desire in John 6:4, that everyone should have eternal life and be raised by Christ on the last day. And eternal life is knowing God and Jesus Christ whom he sent. And this is knowledge comes through us reading the Bible that we can trust. Science is confirming the Bible.